Sometimes when you hear government officials speak, you might notice how their words are vague and ambiguous. They make it sound like something is true, but also not quite. But have you ever wondered if a ghost story had to be explained by a government official? What kind of words would they use? Today's story is about a real incident that happened in Hong Kong. The location was the Murray House from the colonial era. This case became so serious that even the government had to admit it happened, and they were forced to explain it publicly. It remains the only officially acknowledged haunting in Hong Kong's history. Back in the 1960s, central Hong Kong was nothing like the forest of skyscrapers you see today. On the slope of Garden Road stood an English-style red brick building, Murray House. Its tall arched windows and heavy stone pillars could be seen from several streets away. Murray House was first built in 1846 by the British Army, originally as officers' quarters. Over the years, before and after the war, it served many purposes: a military camp, a police station, and later a government office. During the Japanese occupation, it was said to have been used as a prison. By the 1950s and 60s, it had already become one of the colonial government's main office buildings, with different departments spread throughout its many rooms. In those days, becoming a civil servant wasn't about passing exams like today. The saying was, "Knowing the right people is better than knowing your books." Mr. Chan was one such case. He had a distant relative in a senior position who helped him pull strings and hinted that a little tea money would be necessary. That's how he went from being an ordinary young man with no future to stepping through the doors of a government department. Mr. Chan knew full well he hadn't earned his place through skill. So from the very start he worked extra hard. Every morning before sunrise, he would take the tram up to Garden Road, then walk up the old wooden stairs of Murray House to his second-floor office. The stair railings had been worn smooth by years of use, and the middle of each stone step had sunken slightly. During the day, Murray House was full of activity: the clack-clack of typewriters, the rustle of papers, the mixed chatter of colleagues speaking in English and Cantonese. A clock on the wall ticked steadily, and the chimes on the top floor rang loudly enough for the whole building to hear. But what made Murray House so captivating wasn't just its strong colonial character. It was the fact that it had stood through more than a century of history. Some of that history was well known, and some of it was hidden in the cracks of its walls and staircases, waiting for someone to uncover. That year, the department was severely short-staffed. On top of that, several special projects had to be rushed, so almost everyone on the floor had to work overtime nearly every night. Although people complained about the long hours, the extra pay was attractive. For Mr. Chan, it was a reliable way to make some extra money. Usually, even when working late, there would still be a few colleagues around. But that night was different. When the clock struck 9, everyone else had already gone. The whole floor was empty except for him. Mr. Chan kept his head down, sorting through documents. The sound of paper against pen seemed unnaturally loud in the eerie quiet. The yellowish light of the lamps cast soft shadows, and the wall clock's second hand moved one tick at a time, the steady tick-tock almost reminding him that it was getting late. Just as he picked up his coat and reached for the light switch, it was a deep, rhythmic metallic tapping, the unmistakable sound of an old-fashioned typewriter. Each strike was so clear, it seemed to pound right against his chest. Mr. Chan froze for a few seconds. "Is someone still here?" he thought, and began walking towards the sound. The corridor lights flickered twice, like an old bulb struggling to stay lit. When they steadied again, the hallway seemed darker than before. His footsteps creaked on the wooden floorboards, blending with that cold, mechanical typing, steady, deliberate, like someone focused entirely on their work, ignoring the late hour. When he reached the door where the sound was coming from, it was slightly ajar. A thin strip of light spilled from the gap, accompanied by the metallic glint of the typewriter keys. Mr. Chan pushed the door open. The room was empty. The typewriter sat quietly on the desk. A single blank sheet was rolled into the platen. Not a single letter typed. Under the lamp's glow, the silver keys reflected a cold light. It was so quiet, he could hear his own breathing. The typing had stopped the moment he opened the door. A chill shot up his spine to the back of his neck. He instinctively hunched his shoulders. Though uneasy, he forced himself to act normal, shut the door, locked it, and walked quickly downstairs. The next morning, when he stepped into the office, he saw a group of colleagues gathered in silence, all staring at the middle of the floor. Curious, he walked closer. A dozen typewriters, all moved from their desks, were neatly arranged in the center of the room, all facing the same direction, as if awaiting inspection. These typewriters were large and heavy, bolted to the desks. There were no signs of anything being knocked over. It was obvious they hadn't fallen. Someone, or something, had deliberately placed them there. One colleague asked, "Mr. Chan, you were the last to leave last night, right? Did you see anyone?" Mr. Chan hesitated for a moment, then answered, "No, no one." The others muttered among themselves. Some joked it was a prank. Others kept silent, their faces uneasy. Eventually, the typewriters were returned to their desks, locked back into the drawers, and secured with chains. That night, Mr. Chan stayed late again. Even though he felt uneasy, he didn't want one strange incident to scare him off. Near the end of his shift, the whole floor was once again empty except for him. He glanced at the typewriters. The locks were secure, the cabinet doors tightly shut with no gaps. He picked up his coat, ready to switch off the lights. And then a deep, drawn-out laugh, ragged like it came through clenched teeth, filled the silent office. It wasn't the laugh of someone young. It was the voice of an old man, breathy, leaking through gaps in his teeth, somewhere between a laugh and a sob. It grew closer and closer. Goosebumps prickled across his skin. Sweat gathered in his palms. His legs moved on their own. Hurrying toward the door, he didn't even dare to look back. When he locked the door behind him, the laugh seemed to stop, but that cold, wheezing breath still lingered in his ears. That night, he made a silent vow, no matter how much the overtime paid, he would never stay that late again. Ever since those 2 nights of strange events, Mr. Chan never stayed as late as before. He used to work overtime until 9 or 10 at night. But now, he would pack up and leave before the sun went down. He never told anyone about it, the sound of typing when no one was there, the neatly arranged typewriters all over the floor, and that old man's laugh. He knew that even if he spoke up, people might not believe him. Still, Mr. Chan had always been the one in the department who worked the most overtime. This sudden change didn't go unnoticed. Some colleagues whispered to each other, "Mr. Chan's been leaving early lately. Think something's going on at home." One day, just before everyone left, a colleague couldn't hold back anymore. "Mr. Chan, has something happened at home? You're always rushing off lately." Mr. Chan looked at them, hesitated for a moment, then finally spoke. "Nothing at home, but that night when I was the last to leave, I heard typing, went to check, and found no one there. The next morning, all the typewriters were on the floor, like someone had deliberately moved them. The next night, I heard an old man's laugh. He spoke in a calm tone, but several of the older staff exchanged glances. One of them said quietly, "It's not just you, we've had it too." It turned out, one had been in the restroom late at night when they heard a raspy old man's laugh coming from an empty stall. Another, while working, had looked up to see a shadow flicker past the window, so fast it was like a gust of wind. That's why we don't usually stay too late. Hearing this, Mr. Chan felt a chill. His own experience wasn't just a coincidence. The office atmosphere grew tense. People glanced at each other but said nothing more, speaking only in low voices about their ghostly encounters. From the end of the corridor, the wall clock chimed 6 times, each note sharp enough to sting the ears. Mr. Chan looked out the window at the fading light and thought to himself, today, I have to leave before it gets dark. Over the following weeks, as colleagues quietly shared their stories, people became more and more convinced of the strange goings-on. Eventually, no one dared to work late anymore. At 6 o'clock sharp, everyone would pack up and leave together, as if escaping before nightfall would keep Murray House safe. But reality doesn't bend to fear. The department was still short-staffed, and the workload only grew heavier. The backlog of documents and projects became serious. The boss soon noticed. That year, the department head was a foreigner named Johnson, the very picture of a colonial-era manager, neatly pressed suit. Speaking in a crisp, no-nonsense manner, he called a meeting, seating himself at the head of the table and looking over all the staff. Your recent progress has fallen badly behind, Johnson said in a calm but firm voice. I want you all to speed up. Ideally, I'd like you to work overtime to get things done. Of course, I won't force anyone, but I hope you'll understand the department's situation and volunteer to help. I'll do my best to raise the overtime pay. The meeting room went silent. Everyone exchanged glances. Finally, a senior staff member cleared his throat and spoke up. Johnson, it's not that we don't want to work overtime, but strange things keep happening here at night. Everyone's afraid. Johnson's brow furrowed slightly, as if suppressing a smile. Ghosts? The senior continued. I know you're Catholic and may not believe in this sort of thing, but quite a few of us have had personal experiences, laughter, shadows, typewriters going off on their own. People are genuinely unsettled. Johnson tapped his fingers lightly on the table, looking mildly amused. I've heard the rumors about Murray House, but I always assumed they were just urban legends. I didn't think you'd take them seriously. He paused for a moment, his gaze sweeping the room. All right then, I'll stay late myself, after everyone's gone, for a while. That way you'll know there's nothing to worry about. Several colleagues exchanged uneasy looks, but no one said another word. In the meeting room, the tall grandfather clock chimed once, as if marking the beginning of what was to come. Although most people in the department wanted the extra pay from overtime, the haunting incidents had felt far too real. Many had experienced something themselves. So even with Johnson saying he would personally stay until the last and leave after everyone else, not everyone was willing to take the risk. On the first night of this trial, a few braver colleagues stayed behind to work late. Johnson sat in his office, waiting for everyone else to leave before he did. That night was strangely calm, no odd noises, nothing unusual. Not even the usual creak of the wooden floorboards. At 11 o'clock, Johnson picked up his briefcase, locked up, and even allowed himself a little smirk. So-called hauntings, he thought, were nothing but nonsense. The next morning in the meeting, he sounded quite pleased with himself. I stayed until 11 last night, he said. Nothing happened. These urban legends aren't worth taking seriously. But on the second night, Johnson once again stayed until he was the only one left. At 11, just as he was about to lock the doors, he thought he might as well walk one more round through the office, to see if anyone was still working. The sound of footsteps echoed. He froze for a second. Someone still here? The sound came from far away, getting closer, like it was turning the corner from the next corridor. He quickened his pace. When he reached the bend, he saw a figure, short in stature, walking slowly away from him. Most of the lights were already off, the hallway dim and shadowed, so Johnson couldn't tell who it was at first. Hey, why are you still here? Time to go home, he called out. The figure gave no reply, only slowed to a stop. Johnson frowned, took a few more steps forward, and asked again, Didn't you hear me? Still no answer. The figure simply stood there in silence. A slight unease crept into Johnson's mind, but he pushed it aside and kept walking. Just then, The only working lamp at the far end of the corridor flickered twice, the light pulsing between bright and dim. And then, Johnson saw it clearly. The figure had no head. Above the collar was nothing, only a clean, empty stump, the hollow facing him, glowing with a faint dark red under the light. Johnson's mind went blank. His legs felt weak, nearly buckling under him. He stood frozen, unable to move, for what felt like 10 seconds. Then, as if someone had shoved him, he turned and bolted back to his office, barely locking the door before hurrying out of Murray House. The next morning, colleagues noticed Johnson hadn't come in. It wasn't until noon that a senior government official arrived at the office and called a few senior staff into a meeting. It turned out Johnson had given his full account of what he'd seen the night before. His voice still shook as he told them he would never set foot in the building again. The government higher-ups, after hearing it, made an immediate decision: contact the Hong Kong Buddhist Association and arrange for monks to conduct a ritual to help the restless spirits move on, in hopes of calming the staff and restoring their willingness to work. A few days later, several monks from the Buddhist Association arrived, carrying ritual tools, incense burners, and stacks of paper offerings. That day, all work in the building was suspended, and the entire staff gathered outside to watch. The monks set up an altar in the second-floor corridor and lit long sticks of sandalwood incense. The smoke curled slowly upwards, mixing with the old wood scent of the floorboards, until the whole corridor seemed wrapped in a heavy atmosphere. Low, steady chanting filled the air, occasionally punctuated by the clear ding of a bronze bell, the sound echoing through the empty floors. Strangely enough, after the ritual, no further strange incidents were ever reported in Murray House. No more phantom typewriters, no old man's laughter, no flickering shadows. But this case became the only officially acknowledged haunting in Hong Kong government history. Because public funds had been used to pay for the ritual, government procedure required a public explanation. The Government Information Services issued a statement admitting that unexplained phenomena had occurred in Murray House and that Buddhist monks had been invited to perform rituals to reassure staff. At the time, newspapers covered the story in detail, and television crews filmed the entire ritual, footage that still exists today. When pressed by reporters, the department spokesperson left only one statement: the government has no evidence to prove such things don't exist, and no concrete evidence to prove they do. But many of our staff did personally experience these events. From that point on, Murray House never again saw a haunting, but its name would forever be tied to this government-certified ghost story, one of the strangest and most intriguing legends in Hong Kong's history.